Hello and welcome to Scottish Summit 2021. I am Daryl LaBar and this is Increase Code Quality using XrmUnitTest for CE plugins, which probably should get changed to Dataverse plugins. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to go ahead and thank our sponsors for making this event possible. I really do appreciate it and love being a part of such a wonderful event such as Scottish Summit. My first time being a part of it. Wish it was in person, but hopefully next year we can make that happen. So a little bit about me, some of my details, Xrm Toolbox contributor. The main part for this to be looking out for today's session is this XrmUnitTest creator. So this is something I've created. I've been using for 5, 6, 7, 8 years now, and so I'm just going to walk through what it is and how it's benefited me, and hopefully it's something that you can use to benefit yourself as well. So disclaimer. When I say unit testing, it's maybe automated, maybe integration, maybe functional. Like it's going to be a kind of a broad category. Mostly I just mean automated unit testing. Some people would think of this more as integration. Some would think of it as just functional, but no, it's more. I'm just saying automated for the most part, and I'm not thinking of the explicit unit testing. If you talk to Jordi Montagna, he has a more strict definition of unit testing than I do. So just as an FYI, I'm going to use that term, but it's most of the time just going to mean automated. I'm also going to skip the why. I want to explain why testing is great. Just hopefully you know that already and know that you want to use it. Just need some help on how. And this is only going to be focusing on testing the .NET SDK. It isn't going to be focusing on testing JavaScript or anything like that. Just .NET SDK, so that's an external .NET application or plugins, custom workflows, and custom actions, things like that. So there's a couple different camps here. There's the, hey, don't test anything. There's the, hey, let's go ahead and pretty much test everything together, like having a whole new system deployed and test everything on the server. And then there's, hey, let's test everything locally, and you can use different frameworks to do just normal testing, normal .NET testing. That isn't specific to Xrm, to Dataverse. But that gives you this kind of graph, where if the testing is for Sissy's approach here, you're not getting the benefit. If you have the approach here, where you're actually doing the fully automated ALM multi-server environment thing, it will take you months to get that set up and working correctly, and then you can finally start to benefit from that growth. And finally, you have this generic mocking framework where you can get started right away, but you don't really build on each other. It isn't like the next test is easier to write than the first test because you've got a framework going. Usually each test will take the same amount of time. So yes, you have a benefit, but that benefit isn't really growing over time. So what the XrmUnitTest framework tries to do is give this sort of line where you can get up and running quickly, but then each test becomes easier to write, quicker to write, better to write, and you have a increase in your return over your investment, basically. So what is XrmUnitTest? It's open source Dataverse unit testing framework designed to maximize usefulness and minimize costs. That's really important when we think of testing. Make sure that, hey, this is being useful and it's being easy and quick to do. At its core, it's the same thing that you would have with fake Xrm Easy, is you'd have this fake Dataverse service. But it has a lot more on top of that, assumptions, entity builders, etc. We'll get into that. There's fluent support for plugins and workflow faking. And there are no external dependencies. You had dependency on SDK, you had dependency on XrmUnitTest, that's it. Everything else is internal to it. So if you've got another framework you're using for mocking, great. You don't have two frameworks now, you still have that framework and you have this framework. So two different things. It is available on GitHub/NuGet. So these are the projects for GitHub. I'm going to be walking through this XrmUnitTest.example today. So you're welcome to download that and follow along if you want. NuGet, I got 2013, 15, 16, and 09. I have it set up to be based on the SDK versions that are in NuGet, not based on the product name, because that changes all the time. So anyway, let's go ahead and look at this first thing. We want to actually see how do we use this thing, right? And I want to give the simplest example possible, and that's this RemovePhone number formatting plugin. This is a pretty simple plugin that most people will find useful in that they want to remove the phone number formatting. So when you enter in the phone number, maybe use parentheses, maybe use dashes. They want to set it up, or you want to set it up so that you remove all that. So when you save it in the database, you can now search by that phone number just with the actual phone number text. You don't have to worry about putting in the correct formatting, and it will search for that correctly. So that's the idea, is you want to remove that before you actually insert it into your Dataverse database. So that's the plugin. We'll take a look at the plugin real quick, and then we'll take a look at the unit testing. Now, because this plugin doesn't actually touch the database, it just is in memory. You don't actually, it doesn't do a retrieve to the database. It doesn't do a save to the database. It's a plugin that's running in that plugin context and updates the target, and then that's what does it. Because that's what does it, you don't have to worry about faking out or mocking the actual database itself. So this is probably the easiest test we can probably come up through. So here is the plugin itself. Remember phone number formatting. If you look at it, I'm using my own plugin base. Use whatever you want. It's not specific. It isn't dependent on it. I've got methods to go through and create, what is my actual context, pre-operation, post-operation, that kind of stuff, update, create, all that kind of stuff. And then based on that, what code to execute, you don't have to have any of that at all. The one thing that is a little nice is I can go through and say, hey, execute this plugin for the first plugin that's defined for this plugin, first event, first context, plugin context defined for this plugin. So in that case, pre-operation create. So my framework does that for myself. If you don't have it, when you go to actually go test it, you just specify, hey, this is a stage, this is the message type. So that's the only thing you really would have to add if you had your own code base. So don't let that scare you. So plugin's pretty simple. It's going through getting the target, removing the phone number formatting for the account fields 1, 2, and 3, and then it's also doing it for CRM addresses as well. So depending if it's a contact or other entity, all the entities are listed here. So it would be business unit, competitor, site, system user, lead, contact, account. So pretty much all out-of-the-box entities that deal with phone numbers. So it's going to go through and it's going to remove the phone number formatting, and that's a pretty simple function here. It just goes and gets the actual attribute, the number out of the attribute, out of the entity here, and then, hey, give me everything out of that where it is a number only, and give me a new string back and store that back in there. So it strips out anything that isn't a number. So that's the actual plugin. So plugin. Let's go to the test itself. So my naming convention is the plugin I'm running, what state I want to run, context is formatting, and then what the result should be. Should remove formatting. So if we look at the actual plugin itself, creating the plugin, nothing crazy there. I am creating a contact in here, which becomes my target. You will notice I have fluent methods here. Makes it pretty easy to specify what you actually need. Okay, here's the registered event. Again, this is my registered events on my plugin that is dangling on there that says, hey, give me the first one for the contact entity. If you don't have that, you just have to use an overload where you can specify, let me get that overload to pop up, where you can specify what the event is that you want to actually run, that kind of stuff. So you can create your own event rather than using this registered event. So no big deal. No big deal. So we have that. That's the context. And then we have the actual builder down here, builds the provider, and we have the execute. Now, if that seems confusing, it's because it is. But let me back up and make it hopefully a little bit easier. So what we want to test is the execute. That's our act. Hey, I'm arranging some stuff. Here's our act. We want to do this execute method. What does it need? It needs a iService provider. Okay. Anytime we need an interface, the framework provides an interface builder for it. So I have a service provider builder. And what do we need to throw in that thing? We need to throw in a context. Okay, so rather than having a plugin execution context, I have a plugin execution context builder that builds this context. And you build in the target, whatever it's going to be in your context, you build it in, pass it in. So that's the setup. And when you look at it backwards, it actually makes a little more sense, or at least it's easier to follow, I think. So I always explain it that way. So this is building up provider, packing everything in, faking it all together, and then calling it and executing it, and then reasserting that, hey, whatever this contact I send in, this target, make sure that the mobile phone number is now 123. And because this is a plugin, they didn't have to do an execute on the server or anything. We're not having to deal with that. It's just the plugin itself. So this is just, hey, how do we test a plugin? How do we fire the execute method on a plugin in the basic, most simplest form? So that's great. But now let's think about when we actually want to hit the server. Okay, when we want to hit the server, that runs into a whole fun approach. Because now what we want to be able to do is to go through and have this in-memory thing running that's faking everything out. So each time you do a save on it, it just saves in memory. It doesn't hit the server. Every time you do an update, it updates in memory. It doesn't hit the server. That's ideally what we want to do. And the reason for that is it's way cleaner to do it that way than to do just straight fakes. So I'm going to show an example here where we're going to do a plugin where we have MS fakes and we're going to compare that to XrmUnitTest. Now, you can have multiple different ways of faking things out, but I'm just showing you how it's a lot easier to do this with with XrmUnitTest than something like MS Fakes. So rather than having a plugin, we're just going to execute a single bit of logic, one function here, okay? Make name match case. My last name, LaBar, has a B in it. It's not very common, except maybe in France. I don't know. I've never been to France. But it has a capital B in it. So that's great. It's not nearly as common as, say, McDonald's, so people don't always have that B in there. So I wrote a function that goes through and grabs all the context, gets the first and last names, and then it checks to make sure that the name you give it, so maybe LaBar, maybe McDonald in this case, the name you give it actually matches the casing of either that first or that last name. So if their last name is McDonald without the capital C in it, or D in it, it'll go back through and it will say, hey, if the strings are equal but the case is not, then we're going to go ahead and update the casing of that to be the casing that you have provided here with the name. And then we save changes. So this time I'm actually using the link provider for Dataverse, or CDS in this case. Again, you don't have to do that. You could be normal iOrganization service or whatever, but I do want to show that using this link provider makes it even more difficult to fake this out, because it's not just a simple execute, not different update or create, not update. There's stuff going down behind the scene. Everything gets mapped to an execute and then gets processed from there. So that makes it a little more difficult to deal with faking out here. So let's go look at the actual code base to fake this out. Okay. So again, our test method here, we have this new fakes provided by the MS Fakes. So hey, I'm in a stub iOrganization service. Here's the service. I need to go through and for each execute request, I want to run this code instead of whatever would run normally. So we have to interrogate the request. Hey, is this a retrieve multiple? It is. Okay, I'm going to build my response. I'm going to return back a contact with the last name of McDonald. And if it's an update request, I'm going to throw an error if it's not, but if it is, great. I'm going to get the target out of there, and I'm going to set this updated entity, which is outside of this context here, right here. So it's outside of this thing, it's set in there, and now in my act, so this is all the arrange, in my act, it's going to go through and say, hey, I'm going to give you McDonald a capital D, make sure that the name that we get back is a capital D, this updated entity that did get updated, and make sure that D is capital. Basically, that's it. So, yeah, that's how you do it with the with like an MS Fakes. But using something like XrmUnitTest, this is how you do it. One line here where you are setting up your in-memory database. In this case, this local CRM database organization service, create organization service, and then your early bound entities. That's what it uses to determine what your entities are, or what your metadata is, basically. So you don't have to go hit the server for your tests. You don't have to download something ahead of time. You just are using your early bound entities. There's no reason your tests have to actually create early bound entities. They can be created late bound, but it requires the early bound entities in order to define your metadata. So you have to make sure you've got that defined. So you have the service. We go through and create for that service a contact in here, get its ID out. We go through and call our logic. Hey, let's go ahead and make the name match case. Notice lowercase McDonald here needs to be uppercase. We then use that service and we go get it, and we get the last name. And this is just an extension method that does the retrieve multiple, or give me the actually retrieve, which gets the first one and casts it to a contact. Whatever. That's just a helper method. So don't be confused by that. That's not the XrmUnitTest framework. That's just my own little helper method. But anyway, that goes and retrieves it, gives you back the last name, in this case McDonald, and it matches the case. So you assert they're equal. So that's done in, let's see, 98 to 81. Whole method is 17 lines of code, where this one is done from 75 to 26. So you're looking at just 49 lines of code. So way less code. And also, if you have someone that's brand new to unit testing, brand new to coding, this is hard to write. This is hard to think through. I've got to mock out this execute request, even though I'm not calling an execute anywhere, but I got to mock that out, or fake that out, or stub it out, I guess, in this case. And then I got to go through and handle, figure out what it is, and then I got to go through and then handle the update separately from the retrieve. And then I also have to go through and say, well, what happens if I have something else that hasn't been executed? I have to define what that is. In this case, I throw an error, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe you do want to let something happen here. And And it has kind of a brittle test because now everything in your stub matches exactly what you are assuming that state is of that object, rather than what would be the state of the database at the time. So it makes it brittle and harder to maintain, more likely to break when it shouldn't be breaking in the future. All those things, bad idea. This, way better. It's going and collecting or creating that service. It's creating the entity in memory. It's running through whatever that logic is, has no dependency in anything, and then it just tests it. The other thing that's good about this is this actually runs this statement here in the in-memory database. So if I change this to, maybe I forget this, and I have a bug here where I have last name in there, no time, my first name in there twice, the XrmUnitTest will catch that bug because it actually runs the query. It'll run the query. It won't find anyone with the first name McDonald or the first name McDonald because the last name is McDonald. So it won't get returned, and your unit test will fail. So that's another reason that having XrmUnitTest is way better than doing something like stubbing out with like MS fakes. All right. So, but that there are some limitations with the fake authorization service. In the XrmUnitTest, it's only as good as your early bound entities. So just keep that in mind, that if your early bound entities don't match your actual Dataverse system, you can get different results because maybe these metadata is different. Maybe an entity that doesn't exist. Maybe I have attributes that don't exist. So it's only as good as the early bound entities. I'm not handling anything with security. So if you have some important security thing that you need to do, I'm not handling it. Mostly because it's a lot of work on my part, and it's a lot of work on your part to set it up, and I just don't see the benefit in it as much. So, cost is justified the means. That just seems to be too expensive. Reminder, it's not Dataverse. It's not the online server. It will have bugs. It may not match the exact functionality. It may not support everything you want. So just an FYI, that's another issue. And this also is another issue that I always seem to run into with people is when you're running entirely in memory with this fake authorization service, this doesn't help if you have an environment that's broken. If your dev environment works just fine for a plugin, but it fails in QA, it'd be nice to actually test against QA to say, why is QA broken? What's going wrong? Why is it different? And when everything's in memory, you can't really do that. So how do you get over? How do you resolve that issue? Well, you actually connect to the online instance, but that has a whole new set of problems now, because you want to make sure your tests are environment agnostic, which is much harder to do. Normally, when you're running it in memory, you just have a new version of this in-memory thing each time, and you don't have to worry about that. It runs. But when you're dealing with an actual server, you're having to deal with, well, how do I make sure it works on any server that I run against? That's usually a little more harder. That involves cleaning up the data, because maybe you've created this data for the test, and the test is assuming that data doesn't exist there. So if it's been created, then it causes issues. So you got to back it out. So cleaning up the test is vital. You may have issues where plugins that are running locally or on the server aren't running locally, so that may cause issues as well. So that's issues with environmentally agnostic tests. It's hard to set up. The other thing is, how do we handle tests that are local versus server? Do we create local tests over here and server tests over there? But now we've got two tests that may be testing the same exact thing, one local and one server. So that's really wet. That's not dry. And the second option is, well, let's have the same test and switch back and forth. But if that is a way of doing that, how do we get that to work? It should just work out of the box. You should be able to download from your source control repository, run your tests, and everything should work. That's hard to do. You also want a single point configuration there as well. So let's talk through how do we handle this. The XrmUnitTest, it goes with option 2 here by actually switching back and forth. So how do we handle this? First, it's a way to connect. There are some test connections that are defined. So if we go look at this. All right, so here's an example of how do we actually set up this connection. We have this test settings that are defined in the XrmUnitTest. It's just a class where it has these different properties. One of them is a user test config, and this defines the path to that configuration file that we want to use. We want one configuration file for all of our test projects, because I want to go from running locally, hey, everything's good, to saying, hey, run against a server and see if everything still works. I don't want to have a single config in every single project. Bad. I want that done once. Then we have the configure method that says, hey, how do we configure this this test project path? I'm using a pather finder project of type. I don't know, I couldn't think of a better name. But basically, you give it a type, and it goes and finds that the path to that type in on the disk based on where it's compiled from. So it's not where did the compiled file, where is the actual DLL sitting, it's where is that type sitting in the source control. So in this case, hey, go and find this MS test provider, which sits in my one of these projects. Let's show that. Sits in the, right here in the XYZ, hypothetical name, .xrm.test, sits here in this project. So it says, hey, go find the path to this C# file, basically, and then find that directory. So you're finding the path to that file. What is that directory? And then you're saying, all right, go ahead and use this unit test settings.user config. So that's this config that we use to determine what are we connecting to. So that's how you do it and set it up. But most of the time, you're going to be calling this initialize test settings method, which will go through and initialize everything for you that you actually have. So there's assumption XML, we'll get into that later. User test config path, that's what we just talked about. Any builders get in later. Early bound, where's my early bound set? Source control provider, am I using TFS or something else? Test framework provider. So this is, how do we actually determine what an error is? It's pretty simple. It's, hey, how do we get a failed exception? How do we get it inclusive if there is one? XUnit doesn't have one. Microsoft does. So yeah, that's basically all I have to do. Hey, and then what is the actual attribute applied to a test method? So really, really simple, 6 lines of code there to go through and do that. So, but that's how you go through and you initialize the test settings. One other thing that I hate is if I look at this, this is user.config, but user.config is not checked into my source control repository. Only the .config is. So in here, I list every single environment as a separate app setting, and I have a connection prefix of dev. So this says, hey, when I want to go and connect to the server, go and use the dev connection prefix, which then says go and use this one right here. And this is my username and URL and all that stuff's in that nice config. But right now, use local Xrm database is set to true. So if you set that to false, it will go and hit the server. But by default, it's set to true, and that's how it's checked in. Great. And at the bottom, you have a password down here. So this is your actual password. When you check this into TFS or into your source control, it's set in with this empty password, but it's set in to automatically run local. So when you run it on a build server, it will run local. If you don't want to, you have to do some fancy stuff to change this to false and give it a config value, but by default, it'll run local. It also means if a new dev comes on the team, they get local, they get latest, and they build, and they run the unit test, everything should work because it should run local. They shouldn't have to worry about setting in their password. What happens is, since this file isn't checked in, they get latest, this file won't exist, and it will take this file and it will copy it over to this file. And now you can go in and edit your password and never have to worry about getting it checked into a source control repository because that's not checked in. Only that file is checked in. So just, a little helpful file to make sure that you don't check in your password, which I think pretty much everybody has done. If not, you must be really new, really new to working in code. Okay, so that's how you go through and use Xrm. That's how XrmUnitTest is used to set up your connection strings and set up whether you want to run in memory or run against the actual server. So setting this one file flag here in your user config, setting this to false, now runs against the server. Setting to true, runs local. So pretty simple. And then this sets what environment you want to hit. So let's go through a real-world hypothetical example. Sync account to contact. So this plugin, on update of a contact, finds all accounts that contact is the primary contact for the account. And if the account is missing an address, it's going to take the address from the contact and set it to the account. I'm not sure if anybody would ever do this in real life, but trying to come up with examples is kind of hard. So hopefully this at least makes sense of what's going on, why I'm doing it, if not, even if the why is a dumb reason. But okay, just an example. And again, this just is my generic plugin-based stuff. So there's a little bit of extra stuff going on. It isn't required, again, for the testing framework. So let's go take a look at that. Here's our plugin. You can see this all looks similar to before. We have this whole create events. It runs post-operation, create update for the contact. And then here's the method, the actual execute the actual code that gets happened. Go and get the actual contact from the target. Check to see if it has an address one populated. If it does not, say trace, say this didn't get updated, else go ahead and retrieve all the accounts where it is the primary contact. And now for each of those accounts, go ahead and attempt to update the account address. So boom, updates all those information and then updates the actual account. It's a plugin, two methods basically. Not too terribly difficult, 40 lines of code. Yeah, hopefully easy to follow along. So let's look at the actual test for this thing. So we have the arrange. We call this initialize test settings to, again, figure out are we running locally or are we running against a server, because this test is designed to run both local or against a server, one test. We get this organization service, whether we know it's against a server or against the XrmUnitTest local is all determined by the test settings. And then we go through our normal work here. We're going to create our contact. We're going to create our account. We are going to set the primary contact on the account to the contact that we created. And then we go through our logic here. All right, we have the 742 Evergreen Terrace. Many people find that address familiar since it's from The Simpsons. But that's our contact address. We go through, set up the plugin execution where we're populating the target and the event of the actual plugin. So the first registered event in the plugin, in this case, is going to be a post-operation create for the contact. Yep, so execute that. And now we have this assert here where we go and get the actual account and assert that the address line 1 of the account is now equal to the contact account, or contact address line 1. And then finally, when the test is done, we go through and clean up all of our account information and our contact information, so that way our environment is clean. If it's running locally, it will still clean it up. It just isn't that big of a deal, since once the program stops, the memory gets cleared and it's gone. But yeah, so we have some manual cleanup here. So now this test will run both local and against the actual server itself. But there are some things we can do to kind of clean this up a little bit. We don't want to be running these 2 lines of codes every single time. It's pure boilerplate. It's not needed at all. We just assume that it's there, right? There's no reason that this can't just be a lazy method that goes and gets the actual organization service when we need it, and only if we need it. And maybe it's a property of something, and so it's just there. No reason to be having an extra line for every single method. So we want to get rid of that boilerplate. Other things we want to do is we have an issue with this try catch, or this try finally. What happens if we are running through this try and we have an error and we stop to debug the error in the unit test, and then we don't actually let the test run through? The finally never gets executed, which means that the delete never happens, which means now we're creating data that it will never get deleted, and we are dirtying our environment. We aren't keeping it clean. So you have extra test data that's been created and sitting out there that you are going to have to start paying for, and may run into issues with future tests and things of that nature. So that creates some problems that we have to deal with. And it leads to this list of what do we want this to be able to do? What should it do? What should your unit test framework be doing? It should be environmentally agnostic, be able to run in any environment at any time. This means the data has to be unique for each test. So you can, maybe if you're running a test over here and the other developer running over here on their machine, we're both pointing to the server. You want it to be successful as often as you can. You can't be perfect in that because there's lots of ways you can really screw that up, but you want to really be successful as much as it can. You want to make sure that it cleans up data post-test, always gets cleaned up. And then because you can't be sure that the data has been cleaned up post-test, you also have to make sure the data is cleaned up pre-test. So that's kind of fun. And then there's, and again, we want that single point of control between the fake Dataverse and the real Dataverse. I already defined that in the config. It has to be a clean server environment. We want to make sure that junk data just doesn't get created and forgotten about. I always say that if a developer can do something, they will do something. So if they can forget to add delete statements here, they will forget to add delete statements here. And now that's even worse. So this is the best case where I've remembered. What if I forget? Now I'm really screwed. I can't get those values deleted. And yet it has to be easy to also identify what the data is in the test environment. So if I'm looking in the environment and I see test data, I should be able to know that it's test data, and I should be able to know what the test is that created that test data. That's very difficult to do. And at the end, we have to make sure this curve is where we want it to be. We want to make sure we're up here where our amount of effort is getting huge returns, not over here where we're spending way amount of effort for a little return, or over here where we aren't getting any return even though we're not getting very much investment. So we want to make sure we're really maximizing this curve here. So how do we do this? This is where we have some help that's coming. this test method class base. If you ever used MVC before, there's a lot of convention over configuration where, hey, if you name it this way, this will automatically happen, or automagically, if you'd like. Someone say they didn't like automagically. I tend to like it, but so it's convention over configuration, which I refer to as magic. Utilizes these IDs, which are such a simple concept, but I'm amazed at how much I enjoy the concept, or how much it just makes things so clean, feel so good. So I'll go through that. Creates an aggregation service for us, so that part where we had that extra bit of information is gone. That boilerplate's gone. Logs all of our requests, so now we get to know what is everything that's happening with that organization service. It forces IDs to be defined, so you can't create data without knowing that you've actually created it, because if you have the ID defined, you should be able to clean it up. Now you can go and create a generic GUID and not actually clean it up, but it helps a lot that it's doing that and it's creating that. And it's also going to define the name for you automatically. So every time you have a entity that gets created, that entity name of that test, the name of the test will get set to the name of the entity. And then when you run in the environment, you can look in the environment and you can see, oh, this is test data because here is the name of the test that is the name of the entity. And it's also going to use some environment builders to speed up some code reuse. So let's take a look at that. So this is what we had before. Now we're looking at update account address in this clean way here. So we have one method here. This is our test method. It creates this class and calls test on it. Okay, kind of weird to do that, but there's a lot of benefits in having this thing be a class per test. First, we can find data in here that's private to only this test. I don't need to worry about anybody else touching this data. It's using these IDs, which is just an entity that's able to be, our class that's able to be coerced into whatever form you want for that entity. So for example, if I have a string of logical name equals IDs.account, that works just fine. That will get the logical name of the account. If I have a GUID ID, come on. That also works just fine. That will give the GUID. If I have something else, again, also works just fine. If I actually have an account, again, also works just fine. So whatever you need, it is that thing, which makes it so nice. So you don't have to do. I mean, this is kind of a simple thing to do. Entity ID here, or to do .entity.id. It's a small thing here, but yeah, it's a nice thing. I like it. Makes things just feels good. So here's our test here. Same exact test pretty much as before, except we have no boilerplate up here. None of this boilerplate. So in here, it's going to create the test data. So here we're actually going to set the primary contact ID from the contact. Great. And then this environment builder will actually go through and you just say, hey, go ahead and create all my entities that I've defined here. And it will go through and create them all. And it will know the order in which to create them. You don't have to worry about the order. It will also know, you can also set it up to have some child entities here, or some overrides. So like with child entities. So here you give it a parent ID and everything that should have that as a parent, and it will automatically set the correct attribute for you. As long as there's only one. If you got two, then it will just pick one. It may not be the one you want, but usually you only have one relationship there. And so yeah, it just creates it all for you, and you say create, boom, creates it. So that creates my account, creates my contact. If I had 4 contacts here, it would create all 4 contacts, does it all for you. Then we have the test. This is pretty much exactly what it was before, except there is no cleanup at the end, because programmatically, using reflection, the test base will go through and say, oh yeah, this is a test method class. It will look for this ID struct, it will find it, and it will go through and automatically clean up all of your data. So as long as you're able to go through and remember to make sure you include your account and your IDs here in this IDs collection, it will automatically get cleaned up. There is no additional data to clean up, or no additional code to write to clean up data. That's huge. Huge. Yeah, so that's the test method class base. Next up, when you're writing these things, it's kind of hard, a lot of stuff to write and think about. So how do you actually generate this stuff? Generating IDs, and how do we actually get the unit test class created? So let's take a look at that. So let's say I want to add a new class down here. I have this little code generation folder here that lists the snippets that I've added. So if we have a Xrm plugin test, not plugin, we actually want to test. Xrm test method class, there we go, test. And then the state to be tested, when Daryl presents, should be awesome. Plugin name is my awesome plugin. Okay. And now it's stubbed everything out for us. And now we need to create the IDs here. So let's go to LinkPad, which I have open somewhere. Here we go. I've got this LinkPad snippet. It's something I also give away. It's in this LinkPad GUID generator.txt file. And so you can go through and create however, let's see, I need, this case it looks like I'm creating 3 contacts, 2 accounts, and a lead. It will go through and create this, and I can paste it in here. Creating GUIDs by default is really bad in Visual Studio. Like there's like an extension for it, I think. Is it tool, create GUID, and then you're like, I want that one, I think. This one? This one, yeah, okay, copy. Okay, boom, but now it's not in the text, now, yeah. Anyway, it's kind of painful. The LinkPad is way easier. Notice that it alphabetizes things because I'm OCD like that. It will also group them by the entity type. That way you have accounts.a rather than accounts A, accounts B, accounts C, accounts.a, accounts.b. A lot easier there. And then if there's just one, it just gives you the one. So you can go through and define, hey, these are the entities that I will need for my test. And now that you've pasted in here, your cleanup code is done. And if you need to have them all created before the test runs, that's also done as well. Obviously, if you need to give it any data, you need to do that as well. But so that's code generation. Code snippets are here, and LinkPad is here. This is what's included if you ever run my Visual Studio Solution Accelerator plugin in the Xrm Toolbox. You will get all this stuff added to it and the snippets added to your Visual Studio instance. If not, you can just look how to install snippets and grab this from that test project that I have on GitHub. Okay, so that's code generation. Next up, we have assumptions. So this is the time where you have data that you don't want to create for your test. You want to just assume already exists. And this is used to basically initialize your local Dataverse instance by originally using the data from your actual real live version of it. So if you've got, let's say, a particular user or a particular product or something like that, you say, hey, I'm going to assume our product, our 409 formula cleaner, exists. That's a product we always have. It's in every environment. I'm assuming that exists. If it doesn't exist, that's an error. We have an issue. That's what an assumption's for. It isn't to say you've got data. It's very specific data that would be in every single environment, fundamental data. So all you do basically is you go through and let's get back to walkthrough here. So to go through and use this assumption, you got to create your assumption using this entity data assumption base attribute. Kind of long, but it is an actual attribute that you put on your test. So that's the attribute stuff. You can implement this interface if you want to make it to know what entity you should be getting back. In this case, my assumption is a product install. The entity I'm getting back is a product. And then all you do is override this retrieve entity method. And you just say, all right, in order to get the product install, it's going, in this case, I'm saying it's the product where the product number is install. If you had a different way of doing it, maybe it's, 4 other different things you need to do. Maybe you have the same GUID against all environments. I don't know, but whatever way you do to actually retrieve that particular entity, that's the same in every environment. Great. You put it in there, and that's the only code you need to write for that. And then you can start using it in your tests. So in this case, this test is going to assume that I have a product install already in my org. So when I go through and run my test, at this point in time, this product install already exists in this server. If it's local, if it's on the server itself, then it will go and check to make sure it already exists. So at this point in time, you're either guaranteed that it exists on the server if you're running remotely, or you have that record already created in your local instance if you're running locally. And then you can actually access it through this little method here to say, hey, my assumed entities, this is my property for this base class. Go ahead and get the entity that's associated to this attribute. So in this case, it's a product. And now I can say, all right, go ahead and get the description. And I got the description, and I can verify that the description of the product is not null, and that matches my assumed description here. Okay, let's see here. So that's assumptions. And finally, I want to get to entity builders. So we looked at this a little bit, but there's a lot more power to this. Fluent builders are designed to make your life just better. That's the part of the graph where we're able to continue to build, and make things better, faster, and build upon things for you specifically in your project. So fluent builders are a way just to make defining the code that you need easier and faster. So here's some example for using entity builders. I'm going to create a new account builder. Great. Have some new tests here to run through and do, but I can do, let's see, this is example. Okay. That's defining, creating a builder. That's fine. Here are my tests that I'm creating. I have some examples for these builders. So in this case, I am going to get an address 1. So in this case, I'm defining, hey, I don't care what the actual address is, but for my tests, my account needs an address, which is great because now no one else should take a dependency on what that actual address value is, but it can take a dependency that it has an actual address. So that's kind of a simple test for that. I'll go through and do that. And in this case, there's also an option to run post create, which means that after the create happens, it will go through and do some extra logic as well. So yeah, let's actually skip that part for now. But so here's the test here. We are going and getting our entity out using our IDs, and now we can verify that it has an account and has an account number and has an address city. Wait, where does this account number come from? That's kind of confusing. Well, if I look at my account builder, I've defined that every account should have an account number of 10 by default. Change it whatever you'd like, if you'd like, but at least now every account will have an account of 10. This makes life really nice because now wherever I'm running the test, it will always use an account builder whenever it needs a record, an account in the entity builders. And so that way I will always get this defined for everything. So if I go back to account builder or even the environment builder I had before, it will always go through and do that. So that's the account builder we're looking at. There's the environment builder. So here we can do, hey, for this ID, so you can have multiple builders if you want, but for this particular account, one with address, I'm going to use the account builder, and I want it to do this with address 1 to populate the address 1. So you don't have to create it by itself. You can actually use it as a part of your environment builder, and then go ahead and create all my IDs and go and create. If for some reason you want to allow for creating specific IDs, you can skip this line and use this line instead. With accounts without address. So that will just create the one and not all of them. So you can specify that as well. And then finally, let's take a look at the last example here. This is all the parent stuff I talked about before. If you have an account and I have a contact, and I want the contact to be a child of the account, I can just say with child entities, and it will automatically go through and associate itself, meaning that the parent customer ID for the contact will equal the account. That's set automatically for you. And again, that's environment builder is smart enough to go through and apply the correct order. And if you have even things that reference each other, it will go through, create one, create the other, and then update them to point to each other. It does all that magic for you. So yeah, it makes life really, really simple for creating data. So yeah, that's the account builder. And that leads us to questions. If you have any questions, please reach out. Please let me know. My information is listed below. If you do want to reach out on LinkedIn, great. I will be happy to connect to you. Just make sure that you connect and say, hey, I saw your video, or I saw this presentation, and note the presentation. So that way, if you ask me a question in a year and a half, which has happened before, I get connected because of a conference, and then 2 years later, someone asks me a question, I can go and look at, oh yeah, they were in this conference. This is where they know me from, and that way I can kind of tie that together. So just add a note, and I'll be happy to accept that. So if there aren't any questions, thank you so much for joining it, and hopefully you found this beneficial, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.